Chapter 26. They took a circuitous route out of Mount Shannon. Halt wasn't sure if Tennyson was watching their movements, but if he were, the outsider would have seen them depart to the southwest. Once clear of the village, however, they followed a series of back roads and smaller trails that took them in a giant circle until they were headed due east to Craighennis. "What was the name of the fellow who led the false attack?" Halt asked Will at one stage. "Driscoll," Will told him. "Well, we need to make sure that we don't run into him and his scruffy band. Keep your eye on the ground for any sign of tracks." Will nodded. They were all aware that Driscoll and his 30 men were heading in the same general direction they were, to rendezvous with Padraig and the main party a few kilometres from Craighennis. But as the afternoon wore on into evening, they saw no sign of them. Halt assumed they had taken a different route. There was an early moon, and they continued riding after dark. To make up for the time they'd lost taking their original detour to the southwest, Halt led them off the road and they cut across country, directly for Craighennis. Around 9 in the evening, they saw the lights of the little village across the fields. The 3 travellers eased their horses to a stop and took stock of the situation. They were on a slightly elevated position and could see the main road leading out of Craighennis, the road down which Padraig and his men were expected to come the next day. There was no traffic on the road now, no sign of the outlaw band. Halt grunted in satisfaction. "Looks quiet enough," he said, "but keep your eyes and ears open." He touched Abelard with his heel, and the little horse trotted forward. They crossed 2 more fields, then rode out onto the high road. As on their previous visit, the guard post was manned by 2 watchmen. Halt had hoped that they'd encounter the guards from their previous visit. It would save time identifying themselves. But unfortunately, these were 2 new men. They stepped out into the road, one of them holding his hand aloft in a signal for the 3 riders to stop. "Idiots," Halt muttered to his companions. "If we were here to cause trouble, we could simply ride them both down." The sentry who had signalled them to stop stepped forward and peered suspiciously at them. These were not run-of-the-mill travellers, he thought. 2 of them wore mottled, hooded cloaks, rode small shaggy horses, and carried massive longbows. The other rider was taller and rode a heavy-set battle horse. A long sword hung at his side, and there was a round buckler strapped to the saddle ties behind him. These were fighting men, and the sentry was suddenly conscious of the fact that he was outnumbered. "What do you want?" he called. His uncertainty made him abrupt and more strident than he'd intended. The leader of the 3 riders, the bearded one, leaned forward and crossed his forearms over his saddle pommel. "We mean you no harm," he said. The voice was quiet and reassuring, but there was no guarantee that the words were the truth. "Don't come any closer," the sentry called. He wished he'd brought his spear out of the guard shelter. His companion had a spear, but he was armed only with a heavy, long-handled mace. "We won't," Halt told him in a reasonable voice. "We're content to stay here, but we need to speak to your commander." "Our what?" the sentry asked. He wasn't a military man, Horace thought. Halt revised his request. "Your village headman, or the senior member of the watch. We need to speak to someone in authority." The sentry eyed him suspiciously. If he sent Phineas, the other guard, to fetch the headman, he'd be left here facing these 3 alone. He didn't like the idea of that. But at least if he called the headman, he could hand this problem over to someone else, he thought. He hesitated, then decided. "The headman's asleep," he said eventually, not knowing whether he was or not. "Come back tomorrow." "Dismount, boys," Halt said, and the 3 of them swung down from the saddle, in spite of the guard's shrill orders. "No! Stay as you are! Turn around and ride away! You hear me?" The sentry's voice trailed off as he realized that the three strangers were taking no notice of him. Their leader spoke again. "We're setting our weapons down." He led the way, moving to the side of the road, unstringing his longbow and laying it on the grass verge. The younger bowman followed suit. The tall youth unclipped the scabbard from his belt, and the long cavalry sword joined the two longbows on the grass. That done, the three strangers stepped back onto the road, away from their weapons. "There," Halt said. "Now fetch your headman or watch commander." He paused a few seconds and added emphatically, "Please." The two watchmen exchanged a glance. Phineas raised one shoulder in a shrug. The strangers seemed trustworthy, he thought. He sensed what was troubling his friend. "You fetch Clonmel. I'll keep an eye on them." The senior man let go an involuntary sigh of relief. Anything to get this problem off his hands. He came to a decision. Then he thought he'd better make it seem as if this was his idea and he was giving the orders. "All right, you keep him here. I'll get Clonmel." Phineas looked at him and raised an eyebrow. He wasn't fooled by the mock decisive manner of his companion. "Yes, we could do it that way instead," he said sarcastically. "Could we do it sometime before dawn?" Halt asked in an exasperated tone. The watchman took a pace towards him, his hand on the handle of his mace. "I'll go when I'm good and ready," he snarled. "Which is now, right?" Phineas cut across him. The senior watchman drew himself up, trying to reclaim his dignity. Yes. Which is now?" He turned about and hurried towards the village. He looked back several times, but the three strangers hadn't moved, and Phineas stood at ease, facing them, leaning casually on his spear. He turned and increased his pace a little, until he was half running. 15 minutes later, he returned with Clonmel. Halt was quietly pleased to see that Clonmel, who turned out to be the head watchman, was the same man he and Horace had spoken to several nights previously. The man had struck him as sensible and reasonable. He was certainly going to be easier to deal with than the panicky guard who had gone to fetch him. That wasn't to say that Clonmel didn't view the three travellers with suspicion. Halt noticed that he had taken the precaution of arming himself. He wore a sword and a long dirk in his belt. As he approached, the nervous senior guardsman darted into the shelter to fetch his spear. Clonmel glanced at Phineas, then at the three figures standing by their horses in the road. "Well, Phineas, what do we have here?" he asked. Phineas was standing facing them, his spear grounded beside his feet. He touched the spearhead lightly to his forehead in salute. "3 travellers, your honour," he said, grinning. "They've given me no trouble." Clonmel looked more closely at Halt and Horace. "I know you two," he said, and Halt nodded. Then the watch commander shifted his gaze to Will, his brow furrowing. "And you? Weren't you here the other night as well?" The young man looked familiar, he thought, but he couldn't quite place him. "He's the singer, Clonmel," Phineas put in, and Clonmel nodded slowly as recognition dawned. "Of course," he said slowly, "but you weren't wearing that cloak, or carrying that bow. What are you up to?" The question was asked of all three, as his gaze shifted from one to the other. There was something suspicious here, and in these times, suspicions were not to be disregarded. His hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. Then he noticed the trio's weapons were laid by the side of the road, and he relaxed a little. Just a little. He glared at Halt. "I take it you're not a shepherd looking for stock," he said, and the bearded man nodded. "No, you're right about that." Then you lied to me the other night. Why? The challenge was gruff and uncompromising. Halt seemed to take no offence at being called a liar. He replied in a calm, reasonable tone. We weren't sure what we were walking into, he said. These are troubled times, as you may well know. Aye, and they're not helped by people skulking around claiming to be what they're not, Connell replied, with a little heat. He could hear a rustle of movement from behind him. He glanced quickly over his shoulder and relaxed slightly as another dozen members of the guard came shuffling at a half-run down the high street. When he was first alerted to the presence of 3 strangers at the guard post, Connell had sent his son to rouse a platoon of the town guard, telling them to arm themselves and join him. Now they had arrived, and he felt a little more in control of the situation. The numbers were comfortably on his side. Horace sighed to himself. He was a direct sort of person, and this verbal sparring was beginning to annoy him. He and his friends were here to help the people of Craigkennis, not to bandy words in the street in the middle of the night. Connell heard the slight exclamation and turned to him. Something to say, boy? He demanded. Halt's eyebrow went up. I wouldn't be so free and easy with the word boy if I were you, he said warningly. But Connell ignored him, and Horace was already replying. Yes, I've got something to say. My friends and I are here to help you. If you keep us standing here much longer while you throw accusations and insults, we'll just ride on and leave you to the bandits. He was remarkably self-assured for one so young, Connell thought, his brow puckering at the last word. Bandits? What bandits would they be? There are 80 of them heading this way. They're planning to attack you tomorrow and wipe your village out. We came to warn you and to offer you our help. But, if you prefer, you can go back to bed and we'll just ride on. It's really no skin on our nose. Halt glanced sidelong at Horace. The young man's face was flushed with annoyance. I think that's off our nose, he pointed. Horace glanced briefly at him. Whatever, he gets my meaning. And Connell did. So far, Craigkennis had remained undisturbed. But there had been bandits and outlaws running amok in the south of Clonmel, and the trouble had been gradually spreading north, like a dark stain of spilled ink advancing over a map. How do I know you're not with them? He asked, and instantly regretted the question. If they were, they would never admit it, and asking had only shown his indecision. Who are you, anyway? He added angrily, trying to cover the mistake. We're the King's Rangers from Araluen, Halt told him, indicating himself and Will. And this tall, rather aggravated young man beside me is a knight of the Araluen court. Connell frowned. He had no idea what rangers might be. He guessed they must be woodsmen or scouts. But he knew what a knight was, and the tall stranger, in spite of his youth, had the look of a warrior about him. Your Araluen king has no authority here. King Ferris rules, in a manner of speaking, Colonel told them. Interesting, Will thought. There had been a hint of distaste in Colonel's voice as he spoke of the king. He glanced at Halt to see if his mentor had noted it, but Halt's face was a blank mask. Nevertheless, we're all trained fighters, and we might be useful to you, Halt said. Connell scratched his ear, inspected his fingernails, and then replied, Exactly. And I'm thinking if there's an attack coming, it might not be the wisest move to let 3 armed fighting men into the village. Then don't, Halt said immediately. We'll camp in the trees there. If there's no attack tomorrow, we'll go on our way. If there is, you might be glad of a bit of support. And how much use will 3 men be against 80? Colonel asked. He did it more to gain time than anything else. He could see no real danger if these three were content to wait outside the village's hastily constructed defensive barricade. "That depends on the three," said the third member of the group, the one who had posed as a minstrel a few nights ago. The bearded one turned to smile at him. "Well said, Will," he said quietly. Then to Conal, "However much help we can provide, it'll be more than nothing. My main aim is to make sure you have your defenses ready, your men armed and warned. The outlaws will be looking to surprise you. If they find you ready and waiting, it might take a little starch out of them." Colonel considered the point and nodded slowly. "Aye, that makes sense," he said. "I'll have the men stand to at dawn. We do that every day." Halt smiled grimly. "Then do it tomorrow. But the odds are they won't attack then," he smiled. "The enemy will expect you to be ready at dawn. Most places stand to at dawn, as you put it. My guess is they'll wait for you to lower your guard when nothing happens. If I were them, I'd hit you at noon, when people are relaxing, tired from the morning's work and looking forward to their midday meal." Colonel regarded the bearded man. He was small for a warrior, the Hibernian thought, but he carried an air of confidence and authority. He suddenly thought that if there were to be a fight, he'd prefer to fight with this man than against him. "Good advice," he said. "I'll make sure everyone stays ready. Where will you be?" Halt gestured to the forest north of Craigkennis. "We'll bed down inside the trees. Then we'll take a position on that low hill outside the tree line." Colonel stepped forward and offered his hand to Halt. He was a little awkward, realizing that this man had come to warn the village, and so far had been treated with suspicion and distrust. "I owe you thanks," he said. Halt took his hand. "Thank me tomorrow, if we're all still here," he said. Then he and his two companions retrieved their weapons from the grassy verge, mounted their horses, and rode away across the fields to the north. They'd gone 100 meters or so when Horace urged Kicker alongside Abelard. "Halt," he said, and the ranger looked at him. "Something troubling you?" "Yes, I just realized we've left all our camping gear at Mount Shannon," Horace said. Halt let out a deep sigh. "Yes, I remembered that too, just after I told him we'd camp out in the trees." Horace glanced at the sky above them. There were dark clouds scudding across it, blanking out the stars as they passed. "Do you think it's going to rain tonight?" he said. "Probably," Halt replied gloomily.